Picture this. It's late summer, somewhere in ancient Europe, about 20,000 years ago, and an older man is sitting near the edge of camp, watching the younger hunters head out for the day. He's not going with them. Not because he's lazy. We already covered that guy in a different video, but because his knees aren't what they used to be, and frankly, neither is his waistline. He's got a noticeable belly on him, soft, round, the kind of midsection that absolutely nobody would mistake for a chiseled hunter fresh off a kill. And here's the twist that's going to mess with everything you think you know about ancient humans. In this particular group, at this particular moment in history, that belly isn't a problem. It's not shameful. It's not unusual. It might honestly be one of the smartest, most survival-optimized features anyone in that camp is carrying around. So let's ask the question this entire video exists to answer, because it's funnier and more complicated than it sounds. Did ancient humans actually have belly fat? Were there ancient humans walking around with soft midsections, love handles, the occasional dad bod situation happening tens of thousands of years before anyone invented the concept of a gym membership? Stick around because the honest answer involves real science, some genuinely surprising evolutionary logic, and a complete demolition of the lean, chiseled, six-pack having caveman stereotype that pretty much every museum diorama and movie poster has been quietly lying to you about for decades. Let's start by tearing down that stereotype properly, because it's everywhere, and it's doing real damage to how people understand ancient human bodies. Pop culture has spent the better part of a century selling us an image of ancient humans as universally lean, ripped, low body fat action heroes, all rippling muscle and zero softness anywhere on their frame. Basically, a fitness magazine cover model who happens to be holding a spear instead of a protein shake. This image is partly true, partly wildly exaggerated, and almost entirely missing the actual point of what body fat is for and why ancient humans absolutely needed some of it to survive at all. Ancient humans were not bodybuilders. They were not optimized for aesthetics. They were optimized for survival in an environment that could, and frequently did, kill people who didn't have enough stored energy to get through a bad week, a bad season, or a bad year. Let's talk about what body fat actually does biologically, because this is where the whole conversation starts making a lot more sense. Fat is stored energy. That's the simple, unglamorous truth underneath all of it. Every single calorie a body doesn't immediately burn gets converted into fat tissue and stored for later use, functioning as a kind of biological savings account that the body can draw from during lean times, illness, injury, or any period when food intake drops below what's actually needed to keep everything running. In a world without grocery stores, without refrigeration, without any guaranteed food supply chain whatsoever, that stored energy wasn't vanity. It was a genuine life or death buffer against the very real possibility that next week's hunt fails, or the berries don't ripen on schedule, or an early frost wipes out the foraging grounds everyone was counting on. This means a certain amount of body fat wasn't just tolerated in ancient human populations, it was almost certainly actively favored by natural selection, at least up to a point. Individuals who could store fat efficiently during periods of abundance had a genuine survival advantage during periods of scarcity, compared to individuals who burned through every calorie immediately and had nothing held in reserve when conditions turned bad. This is part of a broader evolutionary concept researchers sometimes call the thrifty gene hypothesis, which proposes that humans evolved to be remarkably efficient at storing fat specifically because our ancestors faced such consistent, unpredictable cycles of feast and famine throughout deep ancient history. The genes that made someone really good at holding onto fat during good times weren't a liability back then. They were arguably one of the best survival tools a body could have. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting and a little bit funny because this same thrifty biology that kept ancient humans alive during famine is widely considered one of the major reasons modern humans struggle so much with weight gain today. We're walking around with bodies exquisitely optimized to store fat efficiently during a historical era when food scarcity was a constant, looming threat. Except now most of us live in an environment with constant, immediate access to calorie-dense food, and very little physical demand required to get it. Your body isn't broken, It's just running ancient survival software in an environment that looks absolutely nothing like the one that software was originally designed for. So, next time you're side eyeing a second slice of cake, you can at least take some comfort knowing your body is technically just doing exactly what kept your ancestors alive through a brutal ice age winter. Let's talk specifically about where belly fat fits into this picture, because not all body fat functions identically, and there's a meaningful biological distinction worth understanding here. Subcutaneous fat, the kind sitting just under the skin, including a lot of typical belly fat, functions primarily as that energy reserve we just talked about, along with providing some insulation against cold. Visceral fat, the kind that wraps around internal organs deeper in the abdominal cavity, behaves a bit differently and is more strongly associated with certain modern health risks when it accumulates in excess. Ancient humans almost certainly carried both types in varying amounts depending on individual circumstances. But the overall presence of meaningful body fat, including stored fat around the midsection, would have been a completely normal, expected, healthy feature of human bodies throughout most of ancient history, not some embarrassing anomaly to hide. So, why does the popular image of ancient humans skew so dramatically toward lean and ripped instead of reflecting this more accurate, fat inclusive picture? Part of it comes down to which ancient humans tend to get represented in museums, documentaries, and pop culture generally. We disproportionately picture young, healthy hunters in their physical prime, the people most likely to be depicted actively chasing down a mammoth or sprinting after prey in dramatic illustrations, because that makes for a much more exciting visual than an older group member sitting by the fire with a soft midsection, gradually working through a stash of nuts they gathered last autumn. Athletic, lean hunters absolutely existed and represented a real, important part of ancient human life, but they were never the entire picture, and focusing exclusively on them creates a deeply skewed, unrealistic impression of what ancient human bodies actually looked like across the full range of ages, life stages, and circumstances within any given group. There's also a significant gender dimension to this conversation that deserves real attention, because ancient women's bodies almost certainly carried meaningfully different fat distribution patterns than ancient men's bodies, for reasons rooted directly in reproductive biology. Female bodies, across human history and into the present day, tend to carry higher overall body fat percentages than male bodies, with fat distributed in patterns specifically suited to supporting pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding, which are, let's be honest, three of the most energetically demanding biological processes a human body can undertake. An ancient woman's body needed substantial energy reserves available specifically to support a developing fetus through pregnancy and then sustain milk production for an infant afterward, sometimes for years given how slowly ancient human children matured compared to other primates. This means a certain baseline level of body fat, often including meaningful fat storage around the hips, thighs, and abdomen, wasn't just common among ancient women. It was almost certainly essential to successful reproduction and child survival. An ancient woman who was extremely lean, with very low body fat by modern athletic standards, may have actually faced real fertility challenges since the body has built-in mechanisms that can suppress reproductive function when fat reserves drop too low, as a kind of evolutionary safeguard against attempting pregnancy during periods when the body genuinely doesn't have enough stored energy to support it successfully. This connects directly back to something we touched on in an earlier video about Venus figurines, those small carved statuettes found across ancient Europe, often featuring exaggerated, rounded proportions around the belly, hips, and breasts. Researchers have debated their exact meaning extensively, but one compelling interpretation directly ties into everything we're discussing here. These figurines may represent an idealized image of fertility and successful reproductive health, specifically because that rounded, fat-inclusive body type genuinely was associated with better reproductive outcomes in a world where food scarcity was a constant, serious threat to successful childbearing. If that interpretation holds up even partially, it suggests ancient humans themselves may have actively recognized and culturally celebrated body fat, particularly in women, as a positive, desirable trait, rather than something to hide or be ashamed of, which stands in pretty stark contrast to a lot of modern body image pressure. Let's bring in some direct skeletal and physiological evidence here, because this isn't purely theoretical reasoning. Researchers studying ancient human remains can actually examine certain skeletal markers, along with comparative studies of body composition in modern hunter-gatherer populations who maintain relatively similar lifestyles to ancient humans to build a reasonable picture of typical body fat levels throughout deep history. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, while not a perfect one-to-one substitute for ancient populations, generally show body fat percentages that, while often somewhat lower on average than typical modern sedentary populations, are absolutely not at the extreme leanness levels often depicted in popular media. These are not zero body fat action figures. These are people with completely normal, functional amounts of body fat, including visible fat around the midsection, particularly among older individuals, women, and anyone going through periods of relative food abundance. Now let's talk about seasonal variation, because this is a genuinely fascinating piece of the puzzle that often gets completely overlooked. Ancient human body fat almost certainly wasn't a static, constant feature maintained year-round at some fixed level. It very likely fluctuated significantly with the seasons, tracking food availability across the year in a pattern that some researchers have compared to the natural fat cycling seen in many other mammals that experience seasonal food scarcity. During periods of relative abundance, late summer and autumn in many ancient environments, when fruits ripened, nuts dropped, and animals fattened up before winter, ancient humans likely gained meaningful body fat too, intentionally or not, essentially stocking up ahead of the lean months coming. Then, through winter and early spring, when food became scarcer and harder to find, that stored fat would have been gradually depleted, burned as fuel to make up for reduced caloric intake until the cycle started over again with the next harvest season. This means an ancient human's belly at any given snapshot in time might have looked dramatically different depending on exactly when you happened to catch them. A genuinely soft, rounded midsection in early autumn, gradually flattening out through a hard winter, only to round back out again the following year once food became abundant again. This cyclical pattern of fat gain and loss, repeated annually across an entire lifetime, represents a kind of built-in seasonal rhythm that modern humans with our constant year-round access to food have almost completely lost touch with, but that would have been a totally normal, expected, unremarkable feature of ancient human life across most environments with meaningful seasonal variation in food supply. Let's talk about something else genuinely interesting here. Not every ancient human environment demanded or produced the same body fat patterns, and geography mattered enormously. Ancient humans living in colder climates, particularly during Ice Age conditions, likely carried meaningfully more body fat on average than ancient humans living in warmer, more consistently resource-rich tropical environments, for reasons that go beyond just food storage. Body fat provides genuine insulation against cold, helping retain core body heat in environments where losing that heat could be genuinely dangerous or fatal. Some researchers studying human adaptation to cold environments have specifically pointed to increased body fat, along with shorter limbs and stockier overall builds as part of a broader suite of physical adaptations that helped certain ancient human populations survive consistently colder climates. This means an ancient human living through a brutal northern winter may have carried noticeably more body fat, including more visible belly fat than an ancient human living in a warm, stable tropical environment with consistent year-round food availability and zero need for that same level of cold weather insulation. Now let's address something that probably deserves more attention than it usually gets. Status and access to food almost certainly played a role in determining who in any given ancient group carried more body fat, exactly the way it does in plenty of historical and even modern contexts. In groups with any kind of social hierarchy or unequal access to resources, individuals with higher status, more reliable food access, or simply better luck and connections may have maintained more consistent body fat levels even during lean periods, while lower status individuals bore the brunt of food scarcity more directly and immediately. This isn't a universal pattern across every single ancient group, since plenty of ancient social structures were genuinely quite egalitarian about food sharing, as we discussed in an earlier video. But where hierarchy and unequal resource access existed, body fat distribution within a group likely reflected those underlying social dynamics, with a visible belly potentially functioning as a subtle, physical marker of relative social standing and food security within certain ancient communities. Let's get into something genuinely funny and relatable here because I think this deserves a moment of attention. The idea that ancient humans definitely judged each other's bodies, probably constantly, exactly the way modern humans do, just using completely different standards than we use today. If a rounder, fuller body genuinely signaled successful food access, good health, and strong reproductive prospects in a world where food scarcity was a constant threat, then a noticeable belly might have actually functioned as a status symbol in certain ancient contexts, the polar opposite of how a lot of modern culture treats it. Meanwhile, an unusually thin, gaunt appearance, rather than reading as athletic or disciplined the way it sometimes does in certain corners of modern fitness culture, may have read as a worrying sign of poor health, food insecurity, or illness within an ancient social context. Body image standards, in other words, weren't absent from ancient human life. They were almost certainly very present, just calibrated to completely different priorities than the ones dominating modern media and advertising. Let's circle back to muscle for a moment, too, because belly fat and muscle mass aren't mutually exclusive, and ancient humans almost certainly carried plenty of both simultaneously in ways that don't match the lean and ripped stereotype at all. Physical activity levels among ancient humans were generally quite high compared to modern sedentary lifestyles, involving regular walking, carrying, digging, climbing, and the physical demands of hunting and gathering, which would have built and maintained significant muscle mass across most healthy adult ancient humans. But high activity levels and high muscle mass don't automatically eliminate body fat the way a lot of modern fitness culture assumes they should. Plenty of genuinely strong, physically active, muscular people throughout history, and today carry meaningful body fat, including visible fat around the midsection, simultaneously alongside significant underlying muscle and strength. An ancient hunter could absolutely have been strong, fast, capable of running down prey across difficult terrain, and still carried a soft layer of fat over solid underlying muscle, especially following a good hunting season or during a period of relative food abundance. The lean, zero body fat physique so often depicted in pop culture isn't actually what peak physical capability necessarily looks like. It's a specific, modern aesthetic standard that has very little to do with actual ancient survival fitness. Now let's talk about pregnancy specifically, because this deserves its own dedicated moment given how directly it connects to everything we've covered about female body fat patterns. An ancient pregnant woman's body fat distribution, including significant changes around the abdomen, would have been an obvious, visible, completely normal feature of daily ancient life, exactly as it remains today. Pregnancy itself naturally produces significant changes to abdominal shape and fat distribution that have nothing to do with general body fat levels and everything to do with supporting a developing pregnancy. This means belly size and shape among ancient women specifically would have varied enormously depending on reproductive status at any given moment, completely independent of broader questions about general body fat or food security, adding yet another layer of natural, expected variation to what ancient human bellies actually looked like across any given group on any given day. Let's address one more genuinely interesting wrinkle here: aging. We touched on this briefly with our opening scenario involving an older man sitting out the hunt, and it's worth expanding on directly. Body composition naturally shifts with age in humans, generally trending towards somewhat higher body fat percentages, and gradually reduced muscle mass as people move into older adulthood, a pattern that holds true across essentially all human populations studied, ancient and modern alike. An older ancient human, someone who'd survived past their physically peak hunting years into a role more focused on tool-making, teaching, childcare, or group leadership, almost certainly carried noticeably more body fat, including more visible belly fat than the younger, more physically active hunters in the same group. And given everything we've discussed in earlier videos about how valued and respected elders generally were within ancient social structures, contributing crucial knowledge, experience, and childcare support even when their direct physical hunting capacity declined, that softer, rounder, older body almost certainly wasn't viewed with any shame or judgment. It was simply what a respected, experienced elder's body looked like. A completely normal, expected feature of having survived long enough to gain all that valuable accumulated wisdom in the first place. So let's bring this all the way back to our opening scenario, that older man sitting by the fire with his noticeable belly, watching the younger hunters head out for the day. Based on everything we've actually covered here, that belly almost certainly wasn't some embarrassing anomaly or a sign that he'd somehow failed at being a proper ancient human. It was likely a completely normal feature of his age, his role within the group, his accumulated experience, and quite possibly a visible signal of his relatively secure position and food access within his community. He wasn't the exception to some lean, ripped, ancient human rule. He was a perfectly ordinary representation of how diverse, varied, and genuinely human ancient bodies actually were, shaped by age, sex, season, geography, social status, and reproductive history, in ways that look a whole lot more like the full range of body types you'd see walking down any modern street today than the narrow, uniformly chiseled image pop culture has been selling for decades. So, did ancient humans actually have belly fat? Based on everything we know about evolutionary biology, seasonal food cycles, reproductive demands, cold weather adaptation, aging, and social status, the answer is an enthusiastic, evidence backed yes. And frankly, they probably needed it a lot more than most modern humans ever will. Belly fat wasn't a modern failure of willpower or a sign of declining health standards compared to some imagined leaner, ancient golden age. It was, for an enormous stretch of human history, a genuinely valuable, sometimes literally life saving biological feature carried by hunters and elders and pregnant women and children alike, shaped by season and circumstance, celebrated in carved figurines, and quietly keeping entire groups alive through winters, famines, and hard years that a leaner, less forgiving body might not have survived at all. So the next time you catch yourself feeling a little self conscious about your own midsection, just remember that somewhere back across tens of thousands of years of ancient human history, that exact same soft layer of stored energy was quietly one of the most useful, most survival critical features the human body ever developed. And an awful lot of ancient humans were walking around carrying it with absolutely zero shame whatsoever.